Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 15th of September 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. I'm delighted to say I'm joined today by Mark Anderson from American Free Press. And before we start, I have to say, happy International Democracy Day. We'll be talking about that shortly. But Mark, we're going to begin with the front page of American Free Press as usual, because, of course, as we mentioned last week, over the weekend, you were giving a presentation about the weaponization of the media at a 9/11 event. So how did the event go, first of all, and give us a bit of background into what you were speaking about?
The event in Austin, Texas went quite well. The turnout was very good, and we had it on live stream, and it's archived now. And so a lot of people saw it there as well. And I didn't speak very much on 9/11 events from 15 years ago specific. I spoke broadly of the enabling factor in so much of the perfidy and crime and injustices we see, and that's the media, which by omission and commission distorts the informational landscape to such a degree that we don't know what's happening in reality, for one thing, and therefore without the proper prognosis, we cannot solve our problems. And what you're showing on the screen now, Media Censorship Exposed, was something I used as a handout at the 9/11 event in Austin this past Sunday to just give people a flavor for what I was talking about. I also gave them information on the U.S. main media, major media outlets, as we've discussed before, Mike, colluding in the national election pool to sequester and control tightly the vote count in U.S. elections. And all of this is part and parcel of what I'm calling the weaponized media in a book I'm working on. And I know a minute ago you had showed the front page I was referring to. That article was actually from a couple of years ago in AFP, and the cartoon on the front, it shows a U.S. general controlling a pressman, and on the cartoon, the pressman's paper says, "America needs more wars," and it's called the Lapdog Times. That's the name of the newspaper that the little cartoon reporter has there. At any rate, this is from when the Washington Post and the New York Times were colluding with the CIA and the U.S. military to hide the fact that the U.S. had a drone base in Saudi Arabia. And remember, Saudi Arabia is the homeland of where the U.S. accuses the 9/11 hijackers as having come from, that as most of them as having come from Saudi Arabia. At any rate, this was something I shared, and it really kind of whet the appetite of the listeners at the 9/11 event. And so much more could be said, and it also had to do with the major media like the Times and the Post covering up warrantless wiretapping of Americans' communications for 18 months, and the Post concealing which nations served as secret, unlawful CIA torture prison locations. So one might argue that during a war, the press maybe shouldn't reveal everything about its home country's military actions. But on the other hand, this isn't a declared war. This is an illegal international police action like the American government has been engaging in since the Korean War without a constitutional declaration of war as required by the Constitution. And wiretapping of Americans' communications was involved. And this was a very comprehensive cover-up by the Post and the Times. So I shared this at the 9/11 event, and it was quite a success overall.
Good stuff. Well, just want to highlight that you have an article. Can you remind us the headline of that article on the UK Column website about this subject?
Oh, yeah. Weaponized media targets dissident thought. Excuse me. Weaponized media targets dissident thought. That's the one that came out in March that's been on the UK Column website. You scroll a little ways down, and that's where I dealt with the Time Life publications, these coffee table magazines that purport to tell Americans that the problem isn't corruption in government or corporations. The problem is people that think there's corruption in government and in corporations. So the dissident thought is seen as the real problem, not the problems that dissidents are pointing to.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, well, let's move on then. UK news, and of course, the big UK news is that the Hinkley Point C power station has been approved. And what the government said was that following a comprehensive review of the Hinkley Point C project and a revised agreement with EDF, the government has decided to proceed with the first new nuclear power station for a generation. However, ministers will impose a new legal framework for the future foreign investment and Britain's crucial infrastructure, which will include nuclear energy and apply after Hinkley. And so what they're saying basically is that there's going to be extra security measures put in place because there'll be foreign workers dealing with crucial infrastructure. Now, what they haven't said, and of course what they're, Mark, not allowed to do, is to impose a requirement that British workers would work on this project. And of course, Britain has a shortfall of qualified British workers to work on a project like this, which is why the Chinese are involved in the first place. It's a Chinese design. But they're saying they're going to put in some extra security measures to make sure that that there's no problems with foreign workers working on crucial infrastructure like this. And what they've also said is that they're going to make sure that that the power station can't be sold without the government knowing about it. So this is basically the government saying they're going to take a large enough stake in the actual physical infrastructure to make sure that should that be sold, that they as a major shareholder would not be unaware of that sale. Greg Clark here, who is the Secretary of State for Business, he said, having thoroughly reviewed the proposal for Hinkley Point C, we will introduce a series of measures to enhance security and will ensure Hinkley cannot change hands without government agreement. Well, that's great. But the really great thing about this, of course, is the strike price. Because what we have here is a strike price of something like £93, £92.50 per megawatt hour of electricity is what EDF will be paid for this for 35 years once it begins generating. That compares to the left-hand bar on the graph there, which is £38.91, which is the current wholesale price of a megawatt hour of electricity on the markets. And so there's a shortfall then between the wholesale price that EDF sells energy at and the strike price that they get paid for that energy at. And the difference is made up in consumer bills. So this is not a subsidy, apparently, because it's not taxpayer money, apparently. And yet taxpayers, who are all the consumers of electricity, pay in any case. So that goes onto our bills. Now, of course, if you look at other methods of power generation, particularly renewables, up until recently, offshore wind, for example, had a strike price over £100 per megawatt hour. Energy from waste had £82. Solar energy had £50. And so in each of those cases, the shortfall between the wholesale price and the strike price is made up by the consumer. But the difference here, of course, is that nuclear comprises a much larger component of the overall energy production in the UK. So the effect of this, in this case, is going to be that much bigger. This is a pretty dodgy deal because what they've done is they've put nuclear in the same category as other renewables, and offered a strike price that isn't perhaps certainly isn't available to anybody producing a gas-fired power station, or, well, of course, we can't produce coal-fired power stations anymore because of allegedly greenhouse gases. So that's the situation, and we're going to have to pay lots for this. But don't worry, they've dealt with the security issues. Does this seem reasonable to you, Mark?
You know, it's hard to gauge right out of the starting gate here, Mike. You know, Britain and America have some differences. America has less reliance on nuclear power than we had in recent years because we've had to refit old plants. The NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has not allowed cutting-edge, state-of-the-art nuclear plants to be built, certainly not in any number. energy is a racket in and of itself, and people don't really realize that. We talk about the debt-based money system, a number of things. The medical system comes to mind, the prescription drug, the pharmaceutical industry, the energy industry is a big shakedown of the people. And as you indicated, I think an important point to make here is that if they charge you high energy rates, but they don't tax you for subsidies, the energy rates are just another way of getting into your pocket. So they can say they're not subsidizing it, but they're still passing more costs on to the end consumer.
That's
and I would have to go on.
No, we've got a bit of a delay on the line, Mark, which is why we might be talking over each other. You're absolutely right about that, and there was an example last year, where the UK national grid found itself in the position where it didn't have enough energy to meet demand, and they were required to ask for one or two power stations that were on standby to switch themselves on in an emergency, and they ended up paying an order of magnitude greater amount than the wholesale price that day. I think if the wholesale price was £30 per megawatt hour, they ended up paying something well over 120 for that particular incident. And the whole energy market, the way that it's been privatized in this country, is, as you say, an absolute scam.
Yes. I only point out that when you look at the research of Nikola Tesla, there is such a thing, really, ultimately, as free or at least very inexpensive energy. And I would imagine, and I've written about and I've talked to experts about, a more decentralized system where communities would have their own small power stations and even individual homes in more rural areas especially, and they would actually sell power back to the grid and get paid a rebate. And Germany recently reached a point where they had something like 70 or 80% of their power in sunny tropical paradise in Germany. At any rate, what we don't get is the complete news story, the complete information, where we can have decentralized systems that are more self-sufficient and are not wrapped up in large corporations that are leveraging this strike price as you're describing. Yeah. So much is not reported, and we don't know all our options clearly, and that creates this over-dependency on these systems being constructed by the Chinese.
Indeed. Right. Okay. Well, let's move on to Brexit then. And here we have Herman Van Rompuy, who of course is a former president of the European Council, and he was on BBC Radio 4 this morning, and he's basically saying quite clearly that it's highly unlikely that any negotiations for Brexit could possibly start before next winter. That's winter 2017, because he's saying before the German elections and before there's a new German government, that no serious negotiations could take place. He said you can always start with more technical matters, but the hardcore, the difficult topics will be tackled after the constitution of a new German government, and that will be October, November. So is there ever going to be a Brexit? Well, we say that there isn't. But to reinforce this, the Express today saying, headline, panicked civil servants drew up secret plans before the EU, secret Brexit plans, that is, before the EU referendum. And they're quoting Sir Jeremy Haywood, the head of the civil service, as saying that really they were taken by surprise. They had to work pretty hard to deal with these, or to try to come up with some basic plans, but they didn't tell the government about it. So the Express here said that Sir Jeremy's remarks are in direct contrast with credit rating company Fitch Ratings, who claimed that the British government was not well equipped to quit the EU. But in fact, Haywood's comments are exactly in line with what Fitch said, if they're true, because Fitch saying that the government was not well equipped, Haywood saying that it was the civil service that had done some work, but they hadn't told the government. And so the question lies, how much work have they done? And what has become of that work? Has that been fed into the current situation with David Davis working to get us out of Brexit? So he says. But of course, other indications that Brexit is a scam come from this. because one of the excuses or one of the things that's being highlighted following Brexit is that we're starting to kill Polish people in this country. But apparently that is the excuse for putting Polish police on Britain's streets. Well, we've been warning about this for quite some time, that this was coming. The foreign police would be on the streets of Britain. And here we go. The government saying that these Polish policemen will not have any policing role to play. They're there for visibility only, and to quote, reassure the Polish community. Now, the point that I would make about this is, of course, a number of the, and this comes back to Mark's comments about the weaponization of the media, a number of the press reports about attacks on the Polish community in the last few months since the Brexit result have been lies, in the sense that the attacks took place, but they weren't racist or anti-immigration attacks. These were attacks within the Polish community, and so there was nothing unusual about them. They were just being highlighted as something in the media, something that they weren't. So this problem between British people and immigrants is being stoked up in the media, Mark, and now we have foreign police on Britain's streets.
I've heard similar things, Mike, that at least some of the reports in Sweden of Swedish women being raped or assaulted or accosted by migrants, be they from Syria or other countries, that those reports are exaggerated. And it could very well be for the same reason, to justify this internationalization of police patrolling. It's difficult to believe that these Polish police would be in the UK simply and only for visibility. All that expense and all that time away from their home country. This is not to say that there are not crimes committed by migrants. It's such a large migration in such a short amount of time, caused by the UK and British and Western military machine displacing all these people. We must never forget that. But a number of these reports, Germany, Sweden, are exaggerated, and in some cases literally lies cut from whole cloth. And a lot of these assaults don't take place, or the nature of the assaults is not what we initially heard. So the media, the weaponized media, the biased media, all these different names, these distortions and omissions are critically damaging to our perception of reality, and we cannot get a handle on these things. And that includes, of course, this notion that, hey, Brexit is real. Don't worry, it's coming. We're going to get that divorce from the EU. But nothing really ever happens on this filing for divorce that happened back on June 23rd, and that's all it was. Filing for divorce, getting it finalized is a whole other matter. And it's getting to the point to where even if there was a consummated Brexit, it won't make enough difference if it does happen, because the UK is part of the TTIP treaty, which merges it with the EU economically. And as we've talked about, there's an EU army that Britain is tied up with. How do you exit the EU when you have military and economic ties anyway? So it's such a based, multifaceted scam.
That's absolutely right, and which leads us on nicely to this, because one of the other things we've been pointing out is that the Commonwealth is a very important piece of this jigsaw puzzle as well. So what we believe is happening is a reorientation, perhaps from Europe by Britain towards the Commonwealth. We've seen hints of this over the last few months, but even over the last few years, we've been asking what is the mechanism towards global governance that is going to be used, and we believe the Commonwealth is a mechanism that is absolutely on the cards towards some form of global governance. Now, this is Andrew MacLeod, who's a visiting professor at King's College and a non-executive director of Cornerstone Capital in the United States. He says he was a Remain campaigner and has now combined with Brexit campaigners to form the Brexit Advisory Services at UK's Griffin Law, apparently. So he is basically saying that a post-Brexit Britain can be envisaged, that perhaps we need to be getting in, creating a larger pan-national organisation, the Commonwealth, has existed for many, many years, of course, but it has not been promoted as something quite the same type of capabilities as the European Union. But this is being increasingly discussed, and as this article says, a Commonwealth visa system could save post-Brexit Britain from obscurity. This is the agenda that they're pushing. It's the same type of agenda as the European Union, and just a different mechanism for getting there. But Mark, let's go back to the United States now, and this article in The Guardian. I find this quite staggering because we're seeing in the opinion polls Donald Trump seeming to move ahead as far as the election is concerned, and the timing of this decision by Ford to move all its small car production to Mexico it can't be a coincidence. It absolutely falls into Trump's hands because he can make major political capital with this. So is this just a coincidence, or is this more example of weaponization of press releases and media and corporate interests deciding who's going to be the next US president?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, Mike, exactly where coincidence ends and collusion and perfidy begins. I will say that this works for quite some time. This is part and parcel of the NAFTA treaty, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is 22 years old this year, that was consummated under Hillary's possible future first man, Bill Clinton, who used to be president. God save us, or God help us if we get another Clinton in the White House. But NAFTA was consummated by Bill Clinton in his early days. And this is an extension of that. This is what NAFTA means. It means to move the manufacturing wherever the cheapest labor is. It's always a race to the bottom. And it is going to be something that Trump, no doubt, can make hay with. He can really exploit this to say, see, look at what I told you. American workers come first. We're going to make America the slogan. And so he'll probably, I'm speculating here, he'll probably make a lot of hay of this and say, I'm going to try and reverse this, or at least reduce its impact, and so on and so forth. And so we'll have to really wait and see where this goes. The press will be playing a role here to kind of make it look like Trump has more of an uphill battle than he might have originally perceived in trying to get more manufacturing back to the U.S., perhaps trying to make things look like these are the inexorable tides of history. This is the way it is, Donald. This is NAFTA. Just deal with it. It could be something along those lines. This is pretty fresh. We'll have to see what Mr. Trump says here in the next few days, and I'll be looking very closely at that. No doubt about that. So.
Okay, and then the other piece of U.S. election-related news is, of course, there are hearings still continuing over Hillary Clinton's email servers. And this article from Zero Hedge, excuse the language a little bit. This is BleachBit, which is the company that was providing Hillary with the email services. And they were in front of a committee in Congress and apparently unwilling to say a word about the thing, but they just made fools of themselves in the process, did they not?
I believe so. I saw the Associated Press version, Mike, where one Brian Pagliano, who was a State Department computer specialist tasked with setting up Clinton's servers, he also pled the Fifth Amendment and refused to testify, claiming it would lead to self-incrimination. In my book, that means that I'm guilty, and if I speak about this, I'm going to put my foot in my mouth, so I won't speak about it. So all told, Mr. Pagliano is tacitly admitting guilt, in my view. That's usually how it is with these things. But one of the problems with the Zero Hedge article and the Associated Press article, they both fail to mention what I recently reported in American Free Press, and they're not making it clear that the idea of these hearings was to compare what Hillary told the U.S. House of Representatives about a year ago, last year, and compare that with what she told the FBI in that closed door testimony. I hope we're having technical issues here too much. At any rate, this is what's being put in the background and being overlooked, is that they're looking to see whether Hillary is guilty of perjury. Again, to compare what she told the FBI recently in the closed door testimony on her email servers, which was taken, by the way, not under oath, with her lawyer present on the weekend, which is really flimsy by itself. But they're looking for perjury, to compare what Hillary told the House last year and compare that with what she told the FBI recently. And that search for her perjuring herself is not being mentioned in the press accounts anymore by Associated Press, and as far as I can tell, not by Zero Hedge either. So we're getting a lot of misreporting here, and they're kind of burying the true essential nature of these hearings, and that's to see if Hillary has perjured herself.
Okay, so is this going to have any impact at the end of the day on the actual results?
It should, but like so many things, Hillary just seems to have so many get out of jail free cards. It seems like no matter what people throw at her, it doesn't fully stick, although her own health, rumors and allegations running from Parkinson's to something that seems more factual, and that's pneumonia, her own health being really the main thing that could present an obstacle to her full ascendancy to the presidency. It's difficult to believe that she could have these admitted problems of her health, not to mention her felonious past, and still be on track to be the possible president. When JFK and FDR and others ran, the health issues were suppressed. There's no doubt the media helped suppress them. But had those health issues been as publicized as Hillary's are, if they would have gotten the kind of publicity Hillary's health problems are getting, then Jack Kennedy wouldn't have never been president, very likely, and FDR likely wouldn't have been reelected. His health problems came a little more gradually as his 3 terms went along. So this is a very interesting issue. The hearings, we should be looking to see whether Hillary perjured herself. That was the original point of these congressional hearings. The press is burying that point. So the outcome is, on International Democracy Day, the outcome doesn't look very promising, although we can hope that the fact that she really did perjure herself would sink in with the American people, and they would make sure that she never enters the White House.
Right. Well, speaking of International Democracy Day, here's Baroness Annaley, and she wrote a blog post today. I'm not going to read any of it out. Basically, she's demonstrating in her blog post, however, how important it is, the work of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, working with various NGOs around the world to promote democracy. I suspect that the type of democracy that she's promoting isn't that exciting to people. And of course, here is an example of democracy in action, because David Cameron must be summoned to Parliament to explain his decision to invade Libya, because the invasion of Libya was absolutely a democratic thing, and the deposing of Gaddafi was extremely democratic. So this is Andrew Rosendahl, who's a member of the committee which criticised Cameron's invasion of Libya and the fact that he did nothing, or at least he completely destroyed the country in the process and did nothing to rebuild afterwards. They're expecting Cameron to come back at the earliest opportunity to explain his actions. It's an interesting dynamic going on in Parliament at the moment on this in this area. But just speaking of Democracy Day in general, of course, this is a United Nations program, and they are using it to push the Agenda 2030 Sustainability Development Goals, which themselves are pretty undemocratic. So let's get on to Ukraine. The United Nations has pushed this out today. The situation in eastern Ukraine is worsening, says this UN report. Released today, describes the deterioration of the human rights situation in eastern Ukraine as a result of escalating hostilities between June and August, and the continued disregard for the protection of civilians by both sides of the conflict. They're saying that 9,640 conflict-related deaths and 22,431 injuries among Ukrainian armed forces, civilians, and members of the armed groups since the conflict began in mid-2014. And they're saying that while the situation has improved since the ceasefire was restored on the 1st of September, the situation along the contact line remains deeply unstable, as demonstrated by the incidents which took place last week. In fact, there's a real risk that a new outbreak of violence could happen at any time. Well, I think that's extremely likely because, well, Boris Johnson is there today. And here he is meeting Poroshenko, and he just looks like a buffoon, Mark. He is an idiot. But what was he there for? Well, they are funding a demining project. So the Foreign Secretary is there yesterday and today to reinforce the UK's support for Ukraine on its continued development since independence. The visit will underline the importance the UK attaches to Ukraine's territorial integrity and progress on reform and tackling corruption. No mention of the war at all, but what did Boris say? He said, "I'm very pleased to visit Ukraine so soon after becoming Foreign Secretary, a clear demonstration of the continuing strong relationship between our two countries. The UK fully supports Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, including in Crimea." So he's there to incite the tension, I have no doubt. And in order to fund that, of course, they need money. And the IMF has finally, amazing coincidence, all this coming out at the same time, the IMF has approved $1 billion in Ukrainian aid after a long delay. And the press release says that said it has resumed a bailout of war-torn Ukraine, approving a disbursement of $1 billion in aid package that was held up since August 2015. The IMF said on Wednesday its executive board, which represents 189 countries, had met and approved the resumption. The lending is intended to support Kiev's economic recovery program. Well, we know where this type of aid funding goes to in Syria, so let's just wait and see. But it looks very much like with the UN report, Boris Johnson's visit, and this large amount of money heading to Ukraine, that Ukraine could be being restarted as a new front against Russia, as a resurgence as a front against Russia. Any thoughts, Mark?
Absolutely, Mike. One need only think back to Victoria Nuland, who operated under Hillary Clinton as well. And she, of course, was the one that was instrumental in overthrowing Yanukovych in early 2014 to bring in the Petro Poroshenko regime, which has Zionist undercurrents and certainly is extremely anti-Russian and anti-Ukrainian, because grassroots Ukraine was generally aligned with the modern Russia under Putin. I'm not saying Putin's an angel, but the actual sovereignty of Ukraine is being trod underfoot by Poroshenko, and in association with the UK through Boris Johnson now being Foreign Secretary. That sounds to me, just an opinion, like his reward for being a fake Brexiter. And what's with the haircut? We'll leave that for another conversation.
Well, Mark, you and I can't really comment here because maybe if we had some, we might wear it the same way. I don't know.
I wouldn't try and look like the fifth Beatle or the guy in the Beach Boys that never made the cut. But humor aside, we got to have a little humor for Democracy Day here. This is a grand distortion again by the weaponized media, where Poroshenko is this great Democrat. We'll ignore the fact that George Soros' money and his organizations were involved in installing Poroshenko, in knocking out the former Russian-leaning regime, which is where Ukrainian sovereignty left out the door when he left. This doesn't mean, again, that the former regime was spotless. But this is a very tense situation when you look at it in conjunction with NATO exercises right on the Russian border, right next to it. And this is very, very troubling because they give this democratic veneer to this imposter regime run by this tool, this stooge Poroshenko, and Yatsenyuk, the one they called Yats for short. I don't know his current status, but this was installed under the State Department, and that included in the earlier machinations the Hillary Clinton State Department, and onward post Hillary Clinton, and Victoria Nuland being the main agent there for the West in overthrowing what was the much more grassroots Ukraine government. And now we have this imposter state and saber rattling for war with Russia. And the whole thing is very, very troubling. And the media, again, is just not telling it straight in so many instances.
Okay, well, pressure on Russia, absolutely. Let's look at this Washington Post article because, of course, this is extremely democratic as well. U.S. intelligence agencies are expanding spying operations against Russia on a greater scale than at any time since the Cold War, U.S. officials have said. So they're mobilizing CIA, national security agency, satellite systems, other intelligence assets. They're describing it as a shift in resources across the spy services. The way that this is being ramped up, Mark, the spy agencies clearly getting very excited about the fact that that at the very least this is a new Cold War beginning.
Indeed, the whole war on terror in the U.S. lexicon replaced the Cold War. The Project for a New American Century, which some link to 9/11 because they called for a new Pearl Harbor. Some say that new Pearl Harbor was the 9/11 attacks, and that elements or factions within the U.S. government were partially responsible for 9/11. That was mentioned a lot this past weekend at the 9/11 program in Austin. And so the idea is that the U.S. establishment long ago began working on replacing the Cold War with the war on terror. And what you're talking about, Mike, seems to be another manifestation of this idea. The NSA, the CIA, and MI6 and GCHQ, the whole gamut, is looking at the war on terror as the new Cold War. But the irony is, of course, as we just spoke of a minute ago, they're trying to revive the old Cold War with Russia at the same time. So to have the war on terror with Islam and the Cold War 2.0 with the new Russia is double trouble here in our respective nations, Mike. And we need more than ever a new media, a media to eventually supersede this media through omission and commission from the BBC to ABC that's making it so difficult to navigate this dangerous minefield.
Absolutely. Now, of course, sticking with democracy, I can't imagine a more democratic state on the planet than Israel. So we've kept this one back because this, of course, this news came out yesterday. We kept this for today to discuss it today. Record U.S. military aid deal for Russia signed yesterday. I believe it's something along $36 billion. Is that right?
It's $38 billion. I have some pretty tangible information on this. I spoke right after this to Allison Weir, who I heard her speak live to an audience in Dearborn, Michigan in early July of this year. She's with the organization ifamericans.org. And she outlines through her and her researchers, through many credible sources, the incredible cultural, economic, military, and overall cost to America of supporting Israel, especially in earnest since the late 60s, early 70s, when Israel had the well-known wars of that era. And it's worked its way up to $3.8 billion a year. So this latest record amount is $38 billion, or $3.8 billion a year over 10 years. She did make an interesting point that Netanyahu did not get as much as he wanted. He's been angling to get $5 billion a year, which would have been $50 billion over 10 years, and he didn't get it. What she pointed out is that actually every time Israel gets this aid at the beginning of our fiscal year, that's when it always happens, right around early September, they always say it's a record amount, and it is, because every year it notches up just a little higher by decimal points, by percentage points. But nevertheless, he wanted $5 billion in his most recent negotiations. He's only getting 3.8. Israel is the only country that spends 40% of that aid on Israeli companies, domestic companies of its own. Other countries getting American foreign aid are required to spend virtually 100% of that money on American companies, American defense contractors, and other American contractors. Israel gets away with spending 40% of this aid, 38 billion over 10 years, on its own industries. But finally, according to Alison Weir, in about 6 years, this is a long time, this is very slow, supposedly in 6 years, Israel is required to phase that out and has to spend virtually all, if not all of its aid on American contractors, rather than like now, spending almost half of it on Israeli contractors and getting special treatment. And again, they get their foreign aid in one lump sum. America has to borrow and pay interest on that sum, whereas other nations get their foreign aid throughout the fiscal year in installments. Israel gets special treatment across the board in its domestic spending of our foreign aid and in getting it in one lump sum rather than in installments. And America borrows and has borrowed tens and tens of billions over the years at interest to give this to Israel in one lump sum. And when you consider the destruction wrought upon Palestine by the Israeli forces in such lopsided odds, such powerful, modern, sophisticated weaponry against villagers with crude shoulder-launched rockets and a few stones in slingshots like David and Goliath from the Bible, when you consider the disparities and the media distortion reporting many times over the Israeli atrocities, the Israeli deaths compared to the much higher Palestinian deaths, but making it sound like the Israeli deaths are just as bad or much worse. You add the media disparity, the media distortion, and you truly have a very difficult situation. But that's the reality from a very good source right now.
Okay, well, Mark, I think the theme that has been running, the thread that's been running right through this news program is the story that we started off with, which is the weaponization of the media. And of course, we are hearing that Leveson 2 is on its way in this country. At least that is what's being pressed for at the moment. So the attack on the media in this country hasn't changed. Is there a similar attack still going on? Perhaps there's not needed to be because it's a done deal in the United States.
Yes, there isn't really a need to attack the media. There's, as we talked about earlier, there's an attack by the media on dissident thought, because in America, there's such a multifaceted situation here. There's so many citizen journalists. Of course, they exist in large numbers throughout the world, including the UK. So they're worried about the alternative media. I think it's been infiltrated in some limited areas, although that's very troubling. But they're worried about the alternative media. They don't really have an attack on the media like the Leveson inquiry that I'm aware of, but there's this concentration of ownership here in America of the media that many people are worried about. That was talked about this past weekend at the 9/11 event in Austin. And this concentrated media, for instance, when you look at it, you'll find that the Associated Press coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict distorts reality. Underreporting the number of Palestinians killed. AP reports on Israeli children's deaths much more often than the deaths occurred, but they fail to cover 85% of Palestinian children killed. So to the tune of 85%, the Palestinian deaths are underreported by the Associated Press. That was about 12 years ago. I don't imagine it's improved much now, but yeah, in America, there really isn't anything that I'm aware of like the Leveson inquiry. It's a little bit different situation.
Okay, but of course, to have any kind of democracy, you've got to have a free press. I think we don't, but we'll keep an eye on it and make sure that we do our best to make sure that alternative media covers the stories that the mainstream doesn't. Mark, thank you very much for joining us today. We're out of time. Any closing remarks, briefly?
Well, I would take a note on USA Today having come out with an article battling the Islamic State inside the command center. And it's a very dry recitation of how the U.S. military chooses drone targets. It's depressing in its clinical and surgical language. There's no talk about the moral dimension really, other than what I think are lies and exaggerations trying to get civilian casualties to zero, which I don't think is realistic at all. So the media, instead of really trying to see if these wars are legal, really looking at the moral dimensions, is now reducing this to a matter of analyzing the technique of the military. And this eventually could lead to automated warfare, as we've spoken of, where computers would assess threats and actually launch drones automatically with very little human input. This has already been talked about in war colleges and in studies written for the military, where we would have automated warfare. And we've even had talks about automated journalism, where reporters wouldn't write stories, where computers would write some of the stories. So we really have to, as the independent media that we are, Mike, we really have to look at these trends and sound the alarm. So that's what we're doing today, and that's what we'll keep doing.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to all of you for joining us as well. We'll be back at the same time, 1 p.m. tomorrow. Brian will be back in the studio. We'll see you then. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.